All right, welcome back, everyone, to Applied Wisdom, Literature for Living Better. Today, we're going to really dig into The Great Mental Models, Volume 3, Systems and Mathematics. And just to clarify, that's by Shane Parrish and Rhiannon Beaubien.
Yeah.
Now, I think a lot of our regular listeners are probably familiar with the series. But even if you're not, if you're someone who enjoys kind of thinking about things in new ways, this volume's really interesting because it goes beyond, some of the more traditional models that we often talk about and really gets into how systems work and how a little bit of math can actually be really useful in your daily life.
Yeah. I think it's a bit counterintuitive for a lot of people that math can actually make things simpler.
Right, exactly.
And a lot of us, if we don't have that technical background, we might be like, math, no thank you.
Yeah, math was never my favorite subject in school. No. But I think the Parrish and Beaubien do so well is they really distill it down to these core concepts that, anyone can understand and actually start to apply.
Exactly. They're not throwing equations at us. It's more about, those thinking patterns,
right.
The ways of looking at things.
Right. It's like the mental models behind the math. So our goal today is to really unpack some of these key ideas from the book and see how we can actually put them into practice.
Make them useful.
Exactly. Not just, intellectual exercise.
Yeah.
So I guess, one of the biggest pieces of the puzzle in this volume is this idea of systems thinking, right?
Absolutely.
And it seems like it's everywhere these days, but I think it's still a concept that can be a little bit fuzzy for people. So how would you kind of sum up what systems thinking is really all about?
Sure. I mean, I think at its core, it's really about seeing the bigger picture.
Right.
Right. Moving beyond that simple cause and effect thinking that we often default to and recognizing that the world's really this web of interconnected parts, right? You do something over here and it has these ripple effects over there, like a butterfly flapping its wings and causing a hurricane.
Right.
It's, that idea that everything's interconnected and influencing everything else. So instead of just focusing on individual events or actions, it's about zooming out and seeing how those things fit into those larger patterns and those relationships.
Right. And I think, one of the things that they talk about on the book that I found really helpful is this idea of feedback loops.
Absolutely.
Right? Can you talk a little bit about what those are and why they're so important?
Sure. So feedback loops are they're the engine of how systems behave. Right? Wow. They're those cycles of cause and effect that can either amplify or dampen change within a system. And you've got two basic types, right? You got your balancing loops, which try to maintain stability, like a thermostat, right? It gets too hot, it kicks on the AC, it gets too cold, it kicks on the heat,
right.
Trying to keep things within a certain range. And then you have your reinforcing loops, which are those amplifying loops. So that's where things kind of snowball, right? And that can be a good thing or a bad thing, depending on the situation. But understanding these feedback loops is crucial because it allows you to, kind of anticipate how systems might respond to your actions, right? And then you can start to think about, well, how can I leverage those feedback loops to my advantage?
Right. And so in your own life, if you think about it, where do you see those kinds of loops at play? Whether it's the balancing loops or the reinforcing loops.
Oh, and they're everywhere, right? Like, yeah. I mean, think about your habits, your routines. If you have a good habit that you've established, there's often a balancing loop at play there, right? For me, if I don't exercise for a few days, I start to feel sluggish.
Right.
And then that motivates me to get back to the gym.
Right.
Right. So there's that balancing loop that's keeping me, kind of on track. But then on the other hand, you can have, procrastination, for example. That's often a reinforcing loop, right? The more you put something off, the more anxiety you feel about it, the harder it becomes to actually start. And then you just keep putting it off even more. So it's really important to recognize those negative reinforcing loops and try to break them.
Right.
Right. Because they can really spiral.
Yeah, I think for me, one of the areas where I see reinforcing loops at play a lot is in learning, right? The more I learn about something, the more interested I become in it.
Yeah.
The more I want to learn. And it just kind of creates this upward spiral of knowledge and curiosity.
That's a great example of a positive reinforcing loop, right?
Okay.
You get that momentum going and it just kind of feeds on itself. And that's something that we can all try to cultivate in our lives, those positive reinforcing loops.
Right. Absolutely. So then another concept that they talk about in the book is this idea of stocks and flows.
Yes, one of my favorites. Yeah.
So what are those, and how does that mental model kind of help us think about things differently?
Sure. Well, the basic idea is that you can visualize things as accumulations, which are the stocks, right?
Right.
And then the rates at which they change, which are the flows. So the classic analogy is a bathtub, right? The amount of water in the bathtub is your stock. The water coming in from the faucet is the inflow.
Okay.
And the water going up the drain is the outflow.
Gotcha.
Now, so why is this helpful? Well, because it allows you to start thinking about the underlying dynamics of a system, right? You can ask yourself, okay, what are the key stocks that I need to pay attention to in my life? You
Right.
know, like my health, my wealth, my relationships, my knowledge.
Right.
And then you can think about, okay, what are the inflows and outflows that are affecting those stocks? You know, so for example, if you're thinking about your health as a stock, right? Your inflows might be, you know, healthy food, exercise, sleep.
Right.
Your outflows might be stress, lack of sleep, poor diet.
Gotcha.
And, you know, so by understanding those inflows and outflows, you can start to see, okay, where do I need to make adjustments in order to improve the overall health of that stock?
Right. And I think, you know, for me, one of the things that I've really found helpful about this mental model is that it just makes it really clear that these things don't happen overnight.
Right.
Right. Like, you know, if you want to build wealth, it's not just about, you know, winning the lottery. It's about consistently having more inflows and outflows over time. And so it just kind of helps you to think about what are the small changes that I can make today that are going to have a big impact down the road.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think it helps shift the focus from those quick fixes to more sustainable long-term growth.
Exactly.
Right. And it makes it clear that those small actions that we take consistently can have a really big cumulative effect.
Right. Absolutely. And then another concept that I think is really important and often overlooked is this idea of bottlenecks or constraints.
Yeah, this is a big one.
Right. So what is that all about?
So a bottleneck or a constraint is essentially that one thing that's holding you back, right?
Okay, yeah.
It's the weakest link in the chain.
Right.
And the idea is that, you know, you can make all these other improvements, but if you don't address that bottleneck, you're not going to see much progress.
Right.
So I think the first step is to really identify, okay, what is that bottleneck in my life?
Okay. So how do you do that?
Well, it's about really taking an honest look at your situation. Right?
Yeah.
And maybe asking yourself, okay, what's the one thing that if I could change it would have the biggest positive impact on my life? And it might be something external, you know, like a lack of resources or a time constraint. Or it might be something internal, like a limiting belief or a fear of failure.
Okay.
But once you've identified that bottleneck, then you can start to think about, okay, how do I address it?
Right.
How do I remove that constraint?
And I think that's where, you know, a lot of people get stuck, right?
Right.
Because they might be able to identify the bottleneck,
Yeah.
but then they don't know what to do about it.
Right.
Right. So do you have any advice for people who are, you know, kind of in that situation?
Well, I think, you know, first of all, it's important to remember that you're not alone, right?
Okay.
We all have bottlenecks. It's just part of being human. But, you know, I think one thing that can be helpful is to kind of break the problem down into smaller chunks, right?
Yeah.
You know, so instead of trying to tackle the whole thing at once, think about, okay, what's one small step that I can take today that will move me in the right direction?
Right.
And then just focus on that.
Just make a little bit of progress.
Exactly.
Right. So then, you know, they also talk about this concept of scale.
This is a fascinating one.
Right. And how what works at one level might not work at another level.
Exactly.
So how does that play out in our lives?
Well, I mean, I think it's really important to recognize that scale changes everything, right? What works for an individual might not work for a team. What works for a small business might not work for a large corporation.
Right.
And I think one of the key challenges that we face is recognizing when we need to make those adjustments, right? You know, like we might have a system or a process that works really well at a small scale, but then as things grow, we try to just keep doing the same thing.
Right.
And then we wonder why it's not working anymore.
Right. It's like trying to put out a forest fire with a garden hose.
Exactly.
Right? It's just not the right tool for the job.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's where systems thinking can be really helpful because it allows you to kind of step back and see those larger patterns and recognize when you need to make those adjustments.
Right. And then finally, you know, they talk about emergence, which I think is a really kind of a mind-blowing concept.
It's a little bit drippy.
So what is that all about?
So emergence is this idea that complexity can arise from simple interactions, right?
Okay.
So you have all these individual parts that are interacting with each other, and then all of a sudden, something new and unexpected emerges from those interactions. It's kind of like the flock of birds, right? Each individual bird is just following a few simple rules, but then all of a sudden you get these beautiful, complex patterns that emerge from those interactions.
Right. And so how does that play out in our lives?
Well, I think it's a reminder that we can't always predict or control the outcomes of our actions, right?
Wow.
We can set things in motion, but then we need to be open to the possibility that something unexpected might emerge.
Right.
And I think that can be both exciting and a little bit scary, right?
Yeah.
Because it means that we're not always in control.
Right.
But it also means that there's a lot of potential for creativity and innovation,
Yeah.
New things can emerge that we never could have imagined.
Absolutely. So that's, kind of the systems thinking part of the book. And then they move into mathematical models.
Yeah, which again might sound intimidating.
Right. But they really emphasize that it's not about being a mathematician.
Right.
It's about using these kind of mental models from math to think more clearly about the world.
Exactly. It's about borrowing those tools of logic and reasoning to make better decisions.
Right. Right. And so one of the first things that they talk about is probability and uncertainty.
Yeah, and I think this is so crucial because we live in a world where we're constantly bombarded with information, right? And it's easy to get overwhelmed and to feel like we need to be certain about everything.
Right.
But the reality is that most things in life are uncertain.
Right.
And so instead of trying to fight that, I think it's helpful to embrace it and to start thinking in terms of probabilities.
Okay, so how do we do that?
Well, it's about shifting our mindset from thinking in black and white to thinking in shades of gray, right?
Okay.
Instead of saying this will definitely happen or this will definitely not happen, we start to think about, okay, what are the chances of this happening?
Right.
What are the odds? And by doing that, I think it allows us to be more realistic in our expectations and to make better decisions.
Right. So if you're, kind of faced with a decision, how do you actually go about kind of estimating those probabilities or thinking about, what are the different potential outcomes?
Well, I think it's about, first of all, just acknowledging that you don't know everything.
Okay.
And then it's about gathering as much information as you can, and looking at past data, talking to experts, kind of doing your research.
Okay.
But then also, it's about being honest with yourself about what you don't know and being willing to make decisions based on incomplete information.
Right.
Because that's often the reality.
Right.
We don't have all the answers.
Right. Absolutely. So then, one of the models that they talk about that I think is really interesting but also kind of tricky is Bayes' theorem.
Yeah, this one sounds a lot more complicated than it really is. Yeah.
So how would you kind of sum up what Bayes' theorem is really all about?
Well, essentially it's about updating your beliefs as you get new information, right?
Okay.
So you have a prior belief about something. Maybe it's based on your past experience or your intuition.
Okay.
And then you get some new evidence and you use that evidence to update your belief. And so it's really about, being open to changing your mind as you learn more.
Right. So in practice, how would someone actually use Bayes' theorem? Can you give us an example?
Sure. So, let's say you believe that a certain stock is going to go up in value. That's your prior belief. Now, let's say you read a news article that says that the company is doing really well.
Okay.
They've just had a record quarter.
Uh-huh.
So that new evidence would probably strengthen your belief that the stock is going to go up. Right. But then let's say you read another article that says that the CEO has just been arrested for fraud.
Oh.
Right. That new evidence would probably weaken your belief that the stock's going to go up. Right.
Right.
And so Bayes' theorem is really just a way of formalizing that process of updating your beliefs as you get new information.
Gotcha. And so, one of the things that I think is really interesting about Bayes' theorem is that it kind of highlights how important it is to be open to new information.
Yeah.
Right. And to be willing to change your mind when presented with evidence.
Absolutely. I think in a world where we're often so quick to, dig our heels in and stick to our beliefs no matter what, I think Bayes' theorem is a really valuable tool for kind of helping us to stay open-minded.
Absolutely. So then another concept that they talk about is the law of large numbers.
Yeah, this is a classic.
Right. So, what's that all about?
So the law of large numbers essentially says that the more times you repeat an experiment, the closer the results will get to the true average. Right. So if you flip a coin 10 times, you might get heads 7 times, tails 3 times, right? It's not necessarily going to be a perfect 50-50 split.
Right.
But if you flip that coin 1,000 times, you're going to get a lot closer to that 50-50 split.
Okay.
And so the law of large numbers is really about understanding that small samples can be misleading, right? We need to look at the big picture.
Right. So, in our lives, like, how do we actually apply that?
Well, I think it's about recognizing that one-off events or small samples of data don't always tell the whole story, right?
Okay.
Like if you have one bad experience with a certain type of food, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're never going to like that food again.
Right.
Or if you have one successful investment, it doesn't mean that you're a genius investor. Right. It's about looking at the long-term trends and not getting too caught up in those short-term fluctuations.
Right. And I think this is especially important in today's world where we're just constantly bombarded with information and data, right? And it's so easy to kind of overreact to one piece of information, right? And so the law of large numbers is kind of a reminder to step back and look at the bigger picture.
Absolutely.
Right. And then they talk about this concept of regression to the mean, which I think is also really interesting. What is that all about?
So regression to the mean basically says that extreme events tend to be followed by more average events, right?
Okay.
So if you have a really good performance, you're probably not going to be able to replicate that exact same performance every time.
Right.
And conversely, if you have a really bad performance, you're probably not going to be that bad every time either.
Right.
Things tend to even out over time. Right.
And so I think this is really important to keep in mind, especially when we're dealing with success and failure. It's easy to get caught up in the moment and to think that, oh, I'm on top of the world, I can do no wrong.
Right.
Or conversely, oh, I'm a complete failure, I'm never going to succeed.
Right.
But regression to the mean is kind of a reminder that things tend to even out over time.
Right.
And so it's important to not get too high or too low.
Right. And I think, one of the practical implications of this is that it helps us to not overreact to those extreme events.
Exactly.
Right. Like, if you have a really bad day, it doesn't mean that your whole life is a failure.
Right.
Right. And so it's kind of a reminder to just keep things in perspective.
Absolutely.
Right. So then another model that they talk about that I think is really useful is this idea of margin of safety.
Yeah, this is a big one for kind of, managing risk.
Right. So, what is that all about? So margin of safety is essentially about building in a buffer, right?
Okay.
So you're not operating right at the edge of your capabilities. You're leaving yourself some room for error. So, for example, if you're building a bridge, you don't want to build it just strong enough to hold the weight of the cars that you expect to cross it.
Right.
You want to build it strong enough to hold twice that weight.
Okay.
Right? Because you never know what might happen.
Right.
There might be a traffic jam and there's more cars on the bridge than you anticipated. Or there might be a storm and there's high winds that put extra stress on the bridge.
Right.
And so that margin of safety is there to protect you from those unexpected events.
Gotcha. And so in our lives, like, how do we apply that?
Well, I think it's about, kind of thinking about, okay, areas where I'm operating too close to the edge, is it my finances?
Right.
Am I living to paycheck?
Right.
Do I have enough savings to cover an unexpected expense? Is it my time?
Right.
Am I always rushing around? Do I have enough time to handle unexpected delays or interruptions?
Mm-hmm.
And so building in that margin of safety can really help to reduce stress and to increase our resilience.
Right. And then finally, they talk about network effects.
Yes.
So, what are those? Why are they so powerful?
So network effects are basically when the value of something increases as more people use it, right?
Okay.
So, think about a social network, right? Facebook, Instagram, Twitter.
Right.
The more people that are on the network, the more valuable it becomes for everyone.
Right.
Right. Because you have more people to connect with, you have more content to consume.
Uh-huh.
And so, that's the power of network effects.
Right.
And I think it's something that we can leverage in our own lives.
Well, okay, so how do we do that?
Well, one way is to think about, okay, where are the communities or the networks that I can join that will allow me to tap into those network effects?
Right.
So it might be a professional organization, or it might be a hobby group, or it might just be, a group of friends that you get together with regularly, discuss ideas.
Right.
But by being part of those networks, you can learn from others, you can get support from others, and you can, kind of amplify your own impact.
Absolutely. So, I think we've covered a lot of ground today.
We have.
And I think one of the key takeaways from this book is that these mental models are really just tools, right?
Yeah.
And it's up to us to decide how we want to use them.
Right. They're not magic bullets.
Yeah.
They're ways of thinking, right?
Right.
That can help us to make sense of the world and to make better decisions.
Right, exactly. And so I think, as you're reflecting on all this, think about what are some of the challenges that you're facing in your life right now?
Yeah.
And which of these models might be helpful in kind of approaching those challenges in a new way.
Or what are some of the goals that you're working towards?
Right.
And how can you use these models to kind of, create a path towards those goals?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think, the authors really emphasize that start small.
Yeah.
Right. Don't try to do everything at once.
Right. Pick one or two of these models that resonate with you.
Right.
And really focus on integrating those into your thinking.
Absolutely.
And see how that changes the way that you approach the world.
Right. Right. And I think over time, as you start to use these models more and more, they'll just become second nature.
Absolutely.
Right. And you won't even have to think about it.
It'll just become part of how you see the world.
Right. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's really when the real power of these mental models starts to kick in.
Absolutely.
Well, I think this has been a really fascinating conversation.
I've enjoyed it.
Me too. And I hope our listeners have gotten a lot out of it as well.
Me too.
So thank you for joining us on Applied Wisdom, Literature for Living Better. Stay tuned for the next one. You can subscribe if this helped you. It really helps the channel.
Thanks, everyone.